Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. It's a real treat to meet with you today from all across the country. We're here today to help you eliminate surprises and help your association or associations be better prepared for the future. Components form the foundation of every reserve study. They're the building blocks that make or break your reserve plan. So in this Reserve Studies 101 program, we'll help you avoid the mistakes and help you guide your associations towards an improved future. That's what we're known for here at Association Reserves, and it's going to be a great outcome for investing an hour of your day. Decisions related to reserve components are some of the largest decisions a board makes. Those major elements of your association start new and they gradually deteriorate over many years or even multiple decades. The future brings its own surprises every day, so it's best to take the time to prepare for all your predictable upcoming expenses as you can. And that's what we're going to help you with. So take a look at this slide. We show a typical set of reserve expenses through the years. They are thousands of dollars each scattered out over the years in an irregular pattern. By their size, they make management, insurance, landscaping, or even the power bill look small by comparison. Today, Elon's going to guide you through the process of selecting the right components so you'll be able to see those big expenses coming and take the time to get prepared. And whether you're the board member or the manager, you've got decisions to make in your board or committee meetings. Having an accurate reserve component list gives you and your association an advantage over other associations who don't plan ahead. Let those other associations be the ones who get surprised and suffer from the special assessments and lagging property values that come. So in setting the stage, let me remind you that every reserve study has three parts: the reserve component list, a calculation of reserve fund strength, and a calculated reserve funding plan. Today in our Reserve Studies 101 webinar, we're going to cover the reserve component list, which, as I said, forms the foundation for the reserve study and the other two parts of the reserve study. We have two other webinars in the series addressing those other parts, which we'll present later this year. Watch your email to learn when those will be presented, or you can wait and see recorded versions on reservestudy.com or YouTube. And for your comfort, let me assure you that the material we'll be covering today is all based on National Reserve Study standards, first published back in 1998. We'll have a link to those standards and a link to a new document that is an explanation of those standards in the outline that we prepare of today's program. And that's another reason to fill out the survey at the end of today's program. National Reserve Study Standards is where you'll find the four-part test that defines which projects should be included in your reserve study. And since everyone has been muted to keep background noise to a minimum, during this webinar, the way to respond to a question is to raise your hand by clicking on the hands raised icon in your control panel that looks pretty much like the one you see on screen. So let's give that a try. Grab your mouse and click on the hands raised icon in your webinar control panel if you're ready for Elon to start teaching about components. So let me look up and down the list. Good, I see hands going up. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to click hands down. And Elon, they're all yours.
All right. Thank you, Robert, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. So I want to start off by getting right to the point. And if you're taking notes, this is a key concept to jot down. This is the good stuff, the four-part test that defines project appropriate for funding through reserves, which is found in National Reserve Study Standards. Now, you're going to hear this a lot throughout the webinar today, National Reserve Study Standards, because it is very important. And this is what decides what components go into your reserve study. This is the crux of the matter right here. So, starting at the top, to be included in your reserve component list, a project needs to pass all four parts of this test. First, it needs to be a common area maintenance responsibility, not private property or owned or maintained by another entity. Second, it needs to have a limited useful life, not something that is expected to really last forever. Third, It needs to have a predictable remaining useful life. If you can't anticipate when it will need to be replaced, if you can't put a year on it, then by definition it's unpredictable and you can't plan for it in your reserve budget. And finally, the project needs to be above a minimum threshold of significance. In other words, it needs to be more expensive than what could easily be absorbed into the ongoing operational budget. That threshold for associations is often in the range of 0.5% to 1% of an association's annual budget. If it doesn't pass all 4 elements of this test, it shouldn't be in your reserve study. So with this test, your reserve funds will repair or replace only common area elements with a useful life, predictable remaining useful life, with a significant to your association repair or replacement cost. And we'll get to that a little bit later. There is no industry master list or list proprietary to any reserve study company. If you're following a list, you're gonna miss something. The 4-part test effectively helps find the right projects that should be funded for reserves at your association. The simple 4-part test applies to all associations, like these new townhomes, or maybe high-rise associations, or other associations that are older, or even resort or exotic associations. So take a look here. Deterioration is inevitable and you can't stop it. Look at this barn, it's practically falling apart. Fortunately, reserve projects are very predictable. The reserve component list allows boards and managers to responsibly prepare, meeting their obligation to collect and spend the funds necessary to operate and sustain the association. So join me as I take you on an imaginary walk around a few associations, and I want you to practice applying the 4-part test. Hopefully you'll get an idea of how this works for your association. For each example, practice going through that 4-part test in your head. Is the asset a common area maintenance responsibility? Does it have a limited life? Does it have a predictable remaining useful life? And is it above that threshold cost of significance? Okay, so at this association, the governing documents say that the air conditioning condensers are private property. So they fail test number 1 and shouldn't appear in the component list. This association has some underground parking areas. This structural element is expected to practically last forever, so it doesn't have a limited life, and it fails test number 2 and shouldn't appear in your component list. In that same garage is a sump pump seen here. This is a common area component that pumps water from a catch pit, the low point of the garage, to the street level drains. Nobody that I met during the site inspection ever heard it run, but the garage has never flooded, so it must be working. The building engineer I met on site said it has never been replaced in the last 10 years since he's been there, and a pump like this typically has a useful life of about 10 to 15 years. So really, the association should be ready to replace it at any time because its life has expired, so we'll set that remaining useful life to 0. The point here is you're going to need to get comfortable making some estimates because we're going to have some uncertainties when we're predicting the future. Now, let's take a look at this picture right here. Take you up to a rooftop of an association. On this flat roof is a small hallway ventilator fan. While you can see on the exteriors there's some rusting, inside is a simple motor, fan, and a belt. The association fixes this ventilator as needed as a minor operational expense, so it fails test number 4 and shouldn't appear in the component list. Just want to make sure everyone's with me so far. Do you see how the 4-part test works? Please raise your hands if you're following along.
Same thing here, Elon. We've got, wow, hands, almost everyone's hands up.
100%,
Almost,
okay.
Almost.
All right, there we
I got a
go.
few people on their iPads and they're looking for what do
All
they
right,
touch? Okay, all right. I'm going to put hands down and back to you.
Okay, great. So these are a few easy examples. Now I want to take it up a notch here. So this is a photo looking at the ceiling of the same underground garage that we saw in the previous picture. This association has put up some sheet metal gutters under areas of piping in the ceilings because of leaks, and you can see that in the picture. You can see some corrosion and that might be some calcium, stuff like that, the white areas. So follow me as I go through the 4-part test. First, is plumbing a common area maintenance responsibility? Yes. Second, does it have a useful life? Well, obviously, as this is clearly deteriorating and failing. Third, does it have a predictable remaining useful life? Well, yes. In fact, I think it probably hit zero a few years ago when they put up the gutter. And do you expect piping to be above a minimum cost, repiping the garage? Absolutely. So repiping the garage area is clearly an appropriate reserve project. All right, let's take a look here. So this is a picture of a hillside that experienced some slope failure. Might not look like a big deal. You might just expect to kind of shovel the dirt back on the hill, but this association just received a $50,000 estimate to regrade, slope, and replant it. So is this predictable? Nobody knew this particular hillside was going to fail, but this large association has a lot of hills, and at 20 years old, this is the fourth time a hill somewhere or other has slipped. So if you do some simple math, the hillside here slips about once every 5 years. They might not know exactly where, but association history suggests that if it happened before, it will likely happen again. So we find that it's reasonable to expect this to happen every 5 years or so. Let your own history help you prepare for your future. Okay, so now you know which projects appear in your reserve component list, which don't, and why. Let me take a quick break and ask another poll question. Paige, can you pull up the poll, please? All right.
Absolutely. The question is, how far into the future should you plan for reserve projects? Okay, the answers are starting to come in. Okay. Elon, it looks like people are saying,
Okay.
the majority at 47% say 30 years, 22% say 20 years, 17% say 10 years, and 14% say more than 30 years.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
a pretty good set.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people understanding that there's value in planning far ahead.
Exactly. So we'll touch on that here. So just wanted to remind everyone, we're referring to National Reserve City Standards. Again, like I said, you're going to hear this often. It's the basis of how we select these components. So everyone look at the screen. Note that there's no maximum year limit on the 4-part test. Projections get fuzzier and fuzzier the further you go out into the future, but major projects like roofing, siding, or elevator modernizations are significant and predictable. So it's wise to prepare for these expensive projects with as many years as possible. So you'll have plenty of time to refine your estimates as the time to replace draws near. Okay, component information. So what should you see for each component? What are you going to see in your reserve study? First, in a reserve study, it will be described accurately. Reserve components are projects, not things. So don't expect to see fence. Expect more description like fence replacement, or fence repainting, or fence repaint. This is because it is possible and common to have more than one project for any particular asset. So for each component, expect to see the following information. You'll have identifying information. Typically this means the quantity, but it could also mean a serial number, a size, like a BTU rating of a water heater or a pool heater, or even the horsepower of a pump. And of course, we expect to see the useful life in years, the remaining useful life in years, and the current replacement costs. We'll inflate these costs in the financial analysis portion of our reserve studies as we take a look out into future years. But here in the component list, all we show is current costs. So let's take a look at a simplified component list. It's simplified because we have removed the quantity field for space, but you can see a clear description of the projects like seal and resurface for the 2 asphalt projects, and values for useful life, abbreviated UL, remaining useful life, abbreviated RUL, and the project's current replacement costs. So per National Reserve Study standards, remaining useful life of 0 indicates a project needing to be done in the initial year of the reserve study. All of the projects listed here are very reasonable and predictable. Note that a reserve component list for a small association will likely have a different makeup than one for a large association, because some of the components that are significant to a small association may be under the level of reserve significance to a large association. Again, that threshold cost. So the component list shows the scope of your reserve projects. Scope is the type of projects they are and how expensive they are. The schedule is when these projects are expected to occur and recur over the years. So that is the useful life and remaining useful life. So what we get is a map of expenses. This is different for each association and it changes each year. So if that looks like the component list from the prior slide. This is where we took this from. So remember, irregular does not mean unpredictable. These expenses are all very reasonable and predictable. And in reality, as the years go by, these expenses will move around a bit and get slightly larger or smaller or draw closer or get pushed back a year or two. So your best chance of having the funds when you need them is to update your reserve study regularly. We find that a typical reserve component list contains about 20 to 50 items, but not all reserve component lists are equally significant. Typically, just a few of those 20 to 50 items dominate your reserve study. So take a moment to think how many dominate a financial analysis. Okay, time to think. Okay, so the answer is 5 or less. It's a really, really small number. Often that number is even 2 or 3. All right, here, oh, Robert, this is one of your pictures, right?
Yeah, this is a picture I took because it shows a lot of ships in the water, but clearly there's one ship that captures your attention. My son's a Navy pilot, and this was an aerial photo of his carrier returning to San Diego a few years ago. I like it because it really makes that point that while there may be many things in the water, there's one ship that really captures your attention. And I wanted to make the point that there are just a few reserve components that really capture a person's attention. It's not like you have a long list and they all are equally significant. There's a few that really stand out. And I think that's where you're going to take people next.
Yeah, that's a great example, Robert. Yeah, so let's get back to reserve studies. Your association type and region, where you are in the country, is going to affect the component list makeup. So it's going to alter which ones are big and influential. For a typical townhome association, the dominant components are roofing, painting, and asphalt. In cooler or moist climates, you can add siding and window or deck replacements. In a mid-rise or high-rise condo, you typically don't have as much asphalt or roofing, but you do have major interior hallway projects and major mechanical components such as HVAC systems, boilers, elevators, fire alarm systems, and more. In HOAs and planned developments, like out here in Texas, it's usually the roadway system that's like concrete, or recreational components like fitness centers, splash pads, pool areas, and more. Here's how to separate the influential ones from the other. The most significant components are often not the ones with the largest replacement cost, which is, we're looking at significance, which is cost per year, not the largest cost. So let's take a look here. On the left side, we have a big $100,000 roof project that happens every 20 years and is deteriorating at the rate of $5,000 per year. But a project that is half as expensive on the right side here, a $50,000 repaint project that happens every 5 years, is deteriorating at the rate of $10,000 per year. So don't get distracted by that large cost. It is cost per year that defines a project's influence on your budget. So that's the summary of the component list. It's all driven by the 4-part test. So grab your mouse and give me a hands raised click to show me you're ready for me to change course and talk about getting you ready to face the most common issues related to your component list.
They're staying with you, Elon.
Awesome.
Okay, from across the miles, yeah, look up and down the list, and I got hands raised. Okay, I'm going to put hands down and turn it back to you.
Perfect. Okay, so one of the most common questions we get is what do I do if a big project comes up and it doesn't appear in our reserve study? Can you spend your reserve cash on that project? It's asked all the time. And the answer is that reserve projects are defined by National Reserve Study Standards and the 4-part test, not your reserve component list. So spend the money from reserves and make sure you add that project to your reserve component list in the next update. Again, we mentioned that updates are important, and we will get to this later, how we recommend them annually. So note that it's okay to have multiple components for the same physical asset. This happens when you have different ages on an asset due to phase construction or, say, a reconstruction. So remember from the 4-part test that a component needs to have a distinct remaining useful life. So for example, if your roofing was installed years apart in 3 distinct phases, as in this slide, A, B, and C, you should have 3 different components in your reserve study. Now, suppose you have a whole lot of something, like miles of perimeter fencing at one of my big Texas associations. Sidewalks are another common example. And due to different local factors like sprinklers or weather, traffic patterns, or vegetation, you'll likely find the need for scattered partial replacements instead of, say, a complete replacement. So while you may not know the exact location of those partial replacements, kind of like that hill slippage we saw a few moments ago, you know that every few years you're going to need to spend some money to keep that asset in good shape by replacing those bad areas, the worst areas. So a good solution is to have a partial replacement component. Remember that if this type of project is already happening from your operating budget, planning that expense from reserves doesn't increase your association's cost. You're just moving it from the operating fund, and which is not being planned for, to a budgeted reserve expense. Maintenance is another common question. A reserve component doesn't have to be a literal replacement. Most components need normal maintenance, normal daily, weekly, monthly maintenance, like carpets being vacuumed and gutters and drains being cleared, should be funded through your operating budget. But some major components like the rooftop cooling tower here need expensive maintenance every few years. A $20,000 refurbishment project at the 10-year point will help your $150,000 cooling tower get all the way to its 20-year design useful life. So spend that money if you want to maximize the useful life on your project. So significant scheduled maintenance passes the 4-part test, being a common area maintenance responsibility. It's on a scheduled interval, it has a predictable remaining useful life, and it's above that threshold cost. So the question is, do you replace something that's still working? Make the best decision. Don't replace it just because it's budgeted in the reserve study if it has that 0 remaining useful life. Don't delay and get yourself into a deferred maintenance jam where the project is going to get real expensive, like a leaky roof that causes water damage, or where it causes a big headache, like a boiler failing and leaving everyone with some cold water for a week. Be ready to do your projects on time, but decide what's best for the association. Not replacing a pool heater like what's shown in this picture, which is working just fine, can be a wise decision. The reserve study is a projection of the association's needs, not a binding schedule, so update your reserve study and adjust as necessary. Here's a question. Can you or should you ever spend reserves on a minor repair? That answer is yes, and that is when it extends the component's remaining useful life. If something is broken locally, we recommend to fix it from the operating budget, but if a local repair means that the component will last a few years longer than previously planned, that's a legitimate use of reserve funds. This old fence is nearing the end of its life, but if installing a few new posts in a few key locations for a few $100s means that you can delay replacing the entire $20,000 fence for a year or two, spend the money from reserves and extend the remaining life of the fence in your next update. And note that there are some components that can be a reserve component at one association or an operating expense at another. Pool furniture is a common example. So if you replace your entire set every 5 years, let's say, it qualifies as a reserve expense. But if you replace it a piece at a time, here or there, we'll consider that an operating expense. So either way, the net expense is the same. It just comes from your right pocket instead of your left. So set your reserve component list to fit the spending style of your association and the 4-part test, not just what another association is doing. All right, let's take a look at this little rec room here. So how much detail is appropriate? Do you list all these components separately? Everything with a different component. Look at this rec room. You see the furniture, flooring, pool table, walls that need to be painted, light fixtures, and around the corner is a small kitchen with a refrigerator and stove. We recommend not being too detailed because too much detail becomes clutter. Besides, it's better for your association to think along the lines of refurbishment, meaning grouping projects best done all at the same time, like having one component for all new furniture. It's good to know how many tables and chairs and bar stools you have, and hopefully that's shown in the detailed description of the component in your reserve study, but they don't all need to be separate components if they will all be replaced at the same time. All right, insurance deductibles. So question here, should you budget for insurance deductibles? Different areas of the country have regular exposure to things like wildfires or flooding, hailstorms, or even hurricanes. But going back to the 4-part test, the answer is these insurance deductibles should not appear in the reserve study. The reason is because such expenses fail both the useful life test and the remaining useful life test. You can't predict when these expenses will occur, with the weather and such. These types of expenses are true surprises. Now, before I move on to the next slide, here's the last poll of the day. And this is one I want to pose to you. Can you reserve for painting, even though IRS says painting is not a capital project? Paige, can you launch the poll?
The poll has been launched and answers are starting to come in. All right. Elon, it looks like people are saying that
Oh,
yes,
wow.
you can. 84% say yes, 16% say it depends.
Okay.
Yeah, those are good answers. Elon,
great answer.
10 years ago or so, it would have been just the opposite. So people are starting to get on track with this.
Okay, perfect. So going with the 84% here, the answer is you can reserve for painting. Reserve planning is not limited by IRS regulations. Prepare your taxes according to IRS regulations and prepare your reserve study per National Reserve Study standards. If a project passes the 4-part test, it is a reserve component no matter what IRS regulations say. The IRS regulates taxes, not reserves. And finally, a few weeks after you publish your reserve study, it goes out of date or essentially becomes expired. Your components are in a different state of condition than they were when the report was completed, and your reserve balance has probably already drifted from projections. 2 out of 3 types of reserve studies defined in National Reserve Study standards are updates. For most associations, reserve contributions are one of their largest budgeted line items, often 15 to 40% of their total budget. So update your assumptions and projections regularly. Annually is best. Robert, we're getting to the end of our presentation here. Here's a slide of some of the links you'll have in our outline, right?
Yeah, let me take this one. For anyone wanting some additional information, reading, or insights, we're going to have these links in the outline. You can see some other decision points with respect to deciding if a project is a capital improvement or just a natural upgrade of a project, National Reserve Study standards, an explanation of those standards, some additional thinking on your repair or replace decision, and different types of failure modes. So those will all be a little number of sweeteners to the outline that we provide. Another good reason to fill out that survey at the end of the webinar today. And another free resource that we'll have a link to in our outline is our ebook on reserve components. It's a reader-friendly booklet addressing reserve component issues. And if you enjoyed this program, we'd like to invite you to our next 2 webinars. Next one will be RS 102, the follow-up to this webinar that addresses the financial analysis of the reserve study. Then we'll have running a fiscally responsible association, and that's going to help you know what the 4 standard reports at your association, the standard monthly financial reports, say and what they reveal about your association. How can you effectively work with them, what to look for in them, and how they work together to give you insights into how your association is doing financially. So As with this one, if you're on our email list, you'll receive an email notification of those upcoming webinar dates. And if you're not getting our email notifications, just scroll to the bottom of reservestudy.com and sign up.
All right. Thanks, Robert. So wrapping up today's webinar, I just want to remind our audience that here at Association Reserves, planning to have the reserve funds ready when you need them is a multi-year journey. The first step is getting the components right. The next step is funding them. But that's what we'll cover in Reserve Studies 102, right?
Absolutely. That's how those two programs work together. RO2 is all, Reserve Studies 102 is all about the financial analysis, but I want to get back to your comments. I want to emphasize what you suggested. Getting to the future is a multi-year journey, but by taking the right steps now, it can be a future. You can create a future that you'll enjoy living in. And we can guide you down that path. So looking at the time, on behalf of Elon and myself, we want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found it a good use of your time. Let us know in the comments if you have some ideas for different programs that we can present in the future. We want to help as many associations as possible from our body of experience avoid common mistakes in their pursuit of an improved financial future. So in addition to the free resources that we mentioned, if you'd like our professional assistance, go to our website at reservestudy.com and click on the Request a Proposal link at the top right. It would be our pleasure to come alongside your association, guiding you into the future. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will coordinate our Q&A time. Paige.